Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's installment of the Young Lawyer Division's Listen and Learn series with Saba National. The goal of the series is to connect law students and young lawyers with Saba members who can provide mentorship and professional development advice by creating informational videos on topics that might be relevant to law students and young lawyers who are beginning their careers and looking to understand what the legal profession has to offer. To briefly introduce myself, my name is Adya Kumar. I am currently a federal law clerk. I graduated from Northeastern University in 2022, and I worked as a litigation associate at Skadden for 2 years before beginning my clerkship. And I recently became a member of Saba National's Young Lawyer Division. For today's Listen and Learn series, I have the privilege of chatting with Namrata Joshi, a privacy lawyer and senior legal counsel at Cyberark. With her vast range of experience throughout her legal career, Namrata can help us demystify what being in-house counsel is really like, including by helping us understand the ins and outs of the day-to-day of an in-house attorney, how it compares to other types of legal jobs like working in a law firm or clerking, and tips for young lawyers who are interested in going in-house in the future. So thanks again to Namrata for providing us with some wisdom and insight, and let's get started. So, Namrata, why don't we start with just learning a little bit more about you? Can you tell us about yourself and your journey to going in-house?
Yeah, hi Adya. Thanks for that introduction. I don't know how much wisdom I have to offer, but we will certainly try to provide any kind of insight that we can. As you mentioned, my name is Namrata. I currently am based in Atlanta, Georgia, and I work in-house as senior corporate counsel, focused on data privacy and data usage issues at a cybersecurity software company. But I didn't always start my career in-house. I actually have a background in litigation. I graduated from law school in 2013 and I joined a law firm that was at the time somewhat regional in Florida, but where I gained sort of a broad exposure to a lot of different types of work. I was doing some litigation, I was doing some compliance work for highly regulated companies. I was helping with an investigation under Section 5 of the FTC's Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices Act. And while I was there, I met this really prominent First Amendment media lawyer. And those issues, of course, always have this really interesting constitutional scope. And so I got involved in that. And I was there at the firm for a few years before then segueing, like you, to a federal clerkship. I clerked for a couple of years, and then I kind of decided that I wanted to see what a practice would look like in a smaller boutique law firm environment. While there, I got a lot more exposure to different types of employment, litigation, and law issues, and also to helping counsel some healthcare startups in terms of HIPAA compliance and informed consent when they were looking for second or off-label uses of certain new medications or prescriptions. And after that, in a strange turn of events, I decided, due to just thinking through, like many people during the pandemic, what I wanted to do long term or what I wanted to be when I grew up, I actually decided I wanted to sort of shift into more of the privacy aspect of legal practice. I started seeing, early on in my career, starting with sort of reverse FOIA cases we would do on behalf of corporate clients, and then in the federal court system, seeing that people were filing a lot of sensitive information in the dockets, and then, of course, getting some exposure to HIPAA and related issues, that I really wanted to go down a privacy cyber path. So during the pandemic, it was sort of a strange, amalgamation of events. The judge for whom I previously clerked really needed help. And so she asked if I would come back. And during this time, I also had decided I wanted to take my career in a bit of a different direction. So I studied for the Certified Information Privacy Professionals exam that's offered through the IAPP. And after that, it was sort of just trying to find a role where I would be able to sort of marry the certification with practical experience. And that's what ultimately led me to Atlanta, where I worked at a national law firm. And I actually got hired to support two attorneys locally that were doing IP law. They were primarily focused on intellectual property, but they also had some very sophisticated software contractual disputes. And that's actually how I got involved. And I told them when I got hired that I had this privacy credential and I really wanted to get more exposure to that industry. And they were very happy for me to do both. And at some point in time, it became too difficult for me to actually split my time. And then I decided to sort of make a full transition.
Okay, that's really interesting. It seems like you have truly had a range of experience in smaller firms, bigger firms, clerking. before we talk a little bit more about the transition into in-house, can you describe for us generally what an in-house attorney is and how that's different from let's say, a litigation associate at a law firm?
Yeah. So I think in general, of course, as we all know, when you're in-house, you're basically the corporation's lawyer, right? Or one of them if you're joining part of a robust team. But the way that I like to look at it, you're really meant to be a trusted legal advisor to in-house departments or functions, right? So depending on the nature of the role, you could be supporting a wide range of initiatives and you're operating in sort of a way where you're balancing the risks and realities of what the company's looking to do against what their legal requirements are. And you're partnering closely with the business to help give them advice and make sure that they're doing things in a compliant way, but also helping them to make those risk-based decisions based on your advice. So I would say it's a little different in that when you're probably a litigation associate, excuse me, in a law firm, oftentimes it's task based, and depending on how senior you are, you may or may not be having exposure to court. You may or may not be running your own cases independently. You may be doing a lot more research and writing. I would say in my experience so far, those types of tasks tend to be a bit more limited in the in-house practice.
Okay, and that's a great segue into my next question, which is how easy or difficult might the transition be from going from working at a law firm into going in-house? Could you describe some skills that you would need to have as a trusted legal advisor that might be a little bit different from what you would be used to as a litigation associate? So how did you kind of learn to develop those new skills, if you may or may not have had prior experience with that before?
Yeah, I think like so many things that are new to us, there's a lot of learning by doing, right? So when you're writing orders for the first time or R&Rs or even your first research project or memo, it's all new.
Mhm.
So my view on the law has always been that it's very experiential. And so the first time you do a novel task, it might take you a very long time. But as you do and encounter more of similar types of things, you then adjust to being able to do it much more quickly and efficiently. So it's a similar type of exercise, I think, when you shift from a law firm to in-house, at least for me. There was definitely a different way to communicate. So although being very clear in your communications is always going to be important, I realized pretty quickly, depending on the nature of the ask, right? Oftentimes it's being able to synthesize issues or spot issues very, very quickly for other teams and being able to give very quick, actionable advice that teams internally can act on, whether that's marketing, whether that's finance, whatever the department is, right? Oftentimes people are coming to you because they have something that they're looking for you to solve. And oftentimes you're just trying to come up with the best practical approaches. So it may not always be the case that you're looking at every intricacy of every regulation. Sometimes you are. Sometimes, though, you're just trying to give them sort of the options and make risk-based decisions collaboratively within the confines of legally what you're permitted to do.
That's interesting. So there must be a different way of communicating or a different style of communicating that you might have in-house versus at a law firm. I remember when I would write emails to partners, I would kind of lay out the law like very systematically and kind of explain how that applies to the facts or it doesn't. But you might have a different way of communicating in-house. Is that right?
I think so. And I think often it depends on the nature of what you're being tasked with and also the stakeholder. There's certainly times where we are writing very comprehensive, detailed memos, giving legal analysis, but then there are other times where people are saying, hey, I just have a quick question about A, B, or C, and how can we best accomplish this? And by the way, like we need an answer like
Right.
now. So it just depends on the nature of the ask. But yeah, it's not always the case that we're going to be laying out in very long, detailed memos, every detail of what the legal requirements might be.
Right. And in that same vein, how much of your day to day is legal work versus operational or more business side work?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and I'll speak directly to what I'm doing, which is primarily privacy work. And as many privacy people know, so much of this industry has to do with operations, right? You're getting different teams involved and helping them to help you by enabling whatever it is that you're tasked with. And so for privacy practitioners in particular, the job is heavily operational. It's not always going to be legal. Sometimes you're doing things like fact gathering if you are trying to gather information about a data incident. to determine if it's risen to the level of a breach and what obligations you may have then under the law. Other times, consumers may submit requests to you exercising one of the rights they have under a legal framework, and you're then contacting different teams to access the data and give them portable copies or delete the data, or there's different things that are involved, and that's going to require you going to different teams to actually do the tasks.
Okay, that makes sense. And how often do you work with outside counsel and what is that relationship like?
Yeah, so this is another really interesting question. I think it depends on the nature of what you're looking at. So sometimes for very nuanced or tricky issues, oftentimes we'll go to outside counsel, or sometimes if it's just jurisdictionally outside of my remit, I'll ask if we can, get an opinion from outside counsel, validating something that's very nuanced or complicated, or something that I just have no idea on. And usually by that time, I've done some preliminary investigation and I've tried to come up with a reasonable assessment. At times you just want validation, or if there are times where we just don't have the time, sometimes it's asking for resources surrounding almost like 50 state surveys or global sort of frameworks because we're looking at complicated requirements and we want to make sure to get them right country by country or region by region. And I will say, in my experience, and I've seen it in other places, I think managing the relationship is often easy because over time you get to know outside counsel pretty well. And sometimes they're people with whom you formerly have worked. So in my last role, I was at a multinational insurance company building out the US component of their data privacy program, and I would work with our outside counsel who were people that I formerly worked with in private practice. So, of course, for me, the transition there was natural because I knew them very well. But of course, it was a little different because I was now coming to them in a different capacity. But it does make the relationship much easier. And I think really good outside counsel also realize that the relationship is very important, and giving sort of discrete, practical, actionable advice is really why we're seeking them out in some of the circumstances.
That's super helpful to know. And you have talked a little bit already about how you were looking to kind of go in the more privacy route. Do you think that going in-house, you need to have a specialty like that to go in-house, or are some people with litigation experience, maybe, or even transactional experience, they might be more generalists? Are there opportunities for them to go in-house as well, or what does the specialty versus non-specialty realm look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's opportunities for everybody. And I will say, just to make a caveat, even though I'm technically focused on sort of a discrete area, in my experience, you really sometimes are picking up things that you've never seen or done before, just based on the nature of how certain legal teams are structured. I think there's obviously a very big need for transactional lawyers. Many companies, of course, they're all offering goods or services, right? So there's sometimes very traditional deal teams that need support and sales teams that you're doing transactional contract work with. Other times there are roles overseeing litigation portfolios and things like that. So there are definitely places for people with both transactional and litigation backgrounds in-house. And then there's also a need, I think, at times for specialists, depending on what the area of specialty is. It may not necessarily be that everybody knows how to do that type of work. And depending on the company, they may then one day decide that somebody who's in a bit more of a generalist position would also need to have sort of the responsibilities of shouldering the employment law or the privacy or the information security, which I'm sure can be daunting if suddenly you're taking on new areas, but it's also really good for growth and exposure, right? So absolutely, in-house legal teams are generally comprised of a mix of all of the above, and depending on how big or small the team is, they may have filled the roles in very strategic ways.
Boy, that is super helpful. And another question that just came to mind, which might be something that young lawyers might be thinking about, is how do you see the work-life balance being of an in-house attorney, maybe versus a firm attorney or a different legal role?
Yeah, I think this is a pretty common question and maybe a common misconception, even where I think there's sometimes this idea that working in house means that it's just 9 to 5 and you're completely shut off any other time. I will say that's not always the case. I do think the pace can be different, right? So I remember being before I joined in-house being in a law firm and as an associate, there were times where it was easier for me to manage my workload because I knew what milestones were coming up in my cases and what tasks I would need to prepare for, whether it was motion practice, whether it was depositions, discovery. I will say what I experience now is I may have in mind 4 tasks that I want to accomplish the next day, but 4 additional tasks may come up. So from that perspective, I wouldn't necessarily say that one is, that different from like an hours-based perspective. Of course, it's nice not having to track every 6 minutes of our lives. But at the same time, I think the ebbs and flows just happen to be a bit different.
That sounds right. I think there is kind of the misconception that when you get away from billable hours, it just means you're kind of on a traditional schedule. But I'm sure things will come up for you as well, an in-house attorney that you need to handle. And like you said, those questions where you need that answer right away.
Yeah. And, just based on my experience, I think I alluded earlier to the fact that I do a fair amount of incident response work
Mhm.
and still, right? So if companies have issues where people are potentially, we have third parties with whom we work who are telling us they've had data breaches, or we have internal issues that we have to investigate, or an employee comes and tells us, oops, I emailed the wrong data to the wrong person and it may or may not include personal information. We may have to do more from a legal perspective. Those types of things can happen anytime, right? And particularly in really bad ransomware type scenarios, they tend to happen around holidays. That's just how the cycles are. So at that point, right, your schedule does become a little less predictable. But
Mhm.
overall, I would say it's very possible to lead a really great balanced life being in house. But I will say one thing I really love about it is that no 2 days really look the same. The variety of tasks and the range of work is incredibly different day to day.
That's great. And I think I'm almost out of questions. I'm sure there's more
Sure.
that maybe people will have after watching this video. But for somebody who is interested in going in-house, where do you suggest they begin? Do you think that they need to know somebody who's already there? Can they kind of cold apply? What does that process look like?
Yeah, so this is another great question, and I get asked by students fairly frequently now on LinkedIn through messaging and things. I will say all the in-house roles, which is now only 2 that I've gotten so far, I've done through blind applying. I didn't necessarily have a connection or contact at that company, but I did know about the company beforehand. I knew a fair amount about what the company did, the industry, the competitors, and that helped me to make an informed choice about whether that would be the right fit and the right role for me before even deciding whether to apply. So it's very possible to blindly apply and get past sort of the initial filters and get to the point of interviewing and then getting to an offer. I will say, I think in general, right, it's a lot easier when you have a referral or a connection. And it also gives you really great inside information about how the company operates, how the legal department operates, how they're seen by the business, right? So early on, I went to a privacy conference a few years ago, and one of the biggest takeaways I had, having just taken an in-house role, was that you never want to be seen as a blocker when you're in an in-house legal capacity. And the person who was speaking really just said, I think of it like improv. It's not no, it's yes and yes, and here's how we can do it, or yes, and here's 50 other things we need to consider before we go forward. And I thought that was a really great way of reframing, the conversation. And it's something that I apply all the time. But I do think in general, right, like having connections will really help us, not just substantively, but in terms of like getting insight, hearing about openings and opportunities, and just learning, right? There's never one path. I think everybody has their own trajectory when it comes to their career. But the more people we get to know and the more people we speak with, we kind of have a sense of what people did, how they went about it, how they made their decisions. And it gives us some basic information that we have to go on. So I would say if you're a young lawyer like yourself, it's really great that you're here, part of SABA National and generally out there meeting people and networking. It's invaluable, not just from like a job perspective, but even in terms of making friends, building networks of peers, people you can rely on and ask questions to, right? Because sometimes we don't have all the answers and we need a sense check. And so there are many reasons that I think networking is very valuable. But it's great that you're here doing this now.
Yeah, of course. And thank you so much. I think that was a great way to wrap up our segment today, just kind of reinforcing that networking and connecting, especially amongst South Asian lawyers as well, can be so valuable. And it's really just the best way to find out information. I think a lot of the advice that you gave today with regard to in-house can be applicable across a lot of different fields as well. So really appreciate you taking the time and chatting with me today. And thank you to anybody who's watching.
Thank you. Take care.